Hello and welcome to my presentation of our paper Seems Like a Touch, where we compared the user experience of different visual and haptic presentations of mediated social touch in VR. My name is Julius Tietenberg. I am a PhD student and researcher at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. And in the following, I will give you some insights into the results of our study. But let's start with a short definition of mediated social touch, which can be seen as the simulation or replication of social and emotional tactile interactions and physical contact between individuals within a virtual environment. And why is social touch even relevant for us? I think one major reason is that social touch can be seen as the primary nonverbal channel for emotional communication. And regarding the mediation of social touch, we see that audiovisually presented social touch can on its own trigger affective and physiological reactions, but the combination of visual and haptic stimuli trigger even more intense reactions in users. And if we want to present social touch in a virtual environment, we have basically three common options. We can use clipping, where there's kind of no physical interactions, avatars just clip through each other. We have pseudo-haptics, where we create the visual illusion of a touch interaction by calculating the collision between both avatars and allowing some offset to the actual tracked hand position and the rendered avatar's hand position. And finally, we can use active haptic feedback through haptic feedback devices like vibrotactile feedback devices as in our study. And so these three are also did end up as the experimental conditions of our study. But we also added a fourth condition, which is the placebo condition, in which users were actually wearing haptic feedback devices, but they were not activated. So we just wanted to capture the potential tactile effect of wearing a glove or a vest compared to the active haptic feedback. And what we investigated in our study is the immersive, emotional, and social user experience to get a relatively comprehensive perspective on mediated social touch in VR. And for this, we actually measured presence, embodiment, and illusion of touch, which is special in this case because there's not really a validated measure for illusion of touch that we knew of. So we decided to adapt some rubber hand illusion items from a questionnaire, and we will see some of the results on that later. We also measured the emotional arousal and valence of our users and got some social presence ratings from them. And to help you understand how the study setup looked, we basically built a custom multi-user VR application for our study, where two users embodied as avatars could physically interact with each other from two separate rooms. One person was randomly assigned to be the touch initiator, wearing the haptic gloves, while the other person was randomly assigned to be the touch receiver, who was wearing the arm sleeves and the haptic vest. And now onto our study procedure. I think this should be fairly straightforward. We used a within subjects design, so every of our participant dyads experienced all of the four conditions in a random order. And in the center, you can see the mediated social touch interaction in VR, which was comprised of the initiator stroking the arm of the other person, patting their shoulder, and finally hugging the other person. And after that, both participants had the option to emotionally rate the experience using the self-assessment mannequin directly in VR before they filled out the additional questionnaires on a desktop PC while the study supervisor was able to prepare the next condition. And to quickly characterize our sample, we had 28 participants, 12 of them female and 16 male. Their age was roughly 25 years old with a standard deviation of about 9.5, and basically 4 and 5 were university students, so a very high educational level. We also assessed the comfort with interpersonal touch of our sample and the prior VR experience. And in this case, I think it's fair to assume that we had a fairly high prior VR experience with 25% having used VR more than 10 times and another 29% having used it 5 to 10 times. And to quickly jump into our results, I will start with a short overview and then we go into more specific results. The first surprising result is that we did not find any significant difference in presence, which we would have expected from the literature to find some difference between clipping and pseudo-haptics, and also between the visual conditions and active haptic feedback. We also did not get clear results for embodiment and social presence in our study, but what we got is a non-significant difference in emotional valence, which is basically what we expected because we assumed that there would be a significant difference in emotional arousal, but not for valence. Finally, we also compared the interaction roles, so initiating and receiving touch, but we did not find any difference in this case in our sample. And now onto the more detailed results. We will start with the illusion of touch. In this case, these included items like I felt as if the touch was caused by the other person, for example. And we see that the haptic feedback condition was rated significantly higher compared to the visual conditions. But interestingly, we don't really see any difference between pseudo-haptics and clipping, which we would have expected. And we see a similar trend for the emotional arousal of our participants. Again, the haptic feedback condition resulted in significantly higher emotional arousal ratings for our users compared to all of the visual conditions. So this is basically what we also expected in our study. Then we want to share one result that we stumbled on in our exploratory data analysis after we got the data in our hands, which is the correlation of comfort with interpersonal touch and emotional experience in the form of the SAM ratings. And we see here the CIT and the emotional valence scores for clipping, pseudo-haptics, placebo, and haptic feedback. And we see for the first three, there's not really any kind of correlation. And that is noteworthy, but there's a significant correlation in the haptic feedback condition. And we can see this in more detail here. So this basically means the higher the comfort with interpersonal touch in a participant was, the more positive they rated their touch interaction. And this is interesting because to us this implies that there was some similar reactions triggered by our haptic feedback compared to a real touch interaction, basically. Now to conclude my presentation, I have a few takeaways and then some further outlook. Let's start with the takeaways. And I think one primary takeaway of our study is that the effects of pseudo-haptics that were found in human-object interaction may not really be fully transferable to mediated social touch because it's much more dynamic, much more complicated. The line of sight is much more obstructed by the other avatar and so on. Second, we did not find evidence for a significant effect of just wearing a haptic feedback device. So beyond the active haptic feedback, there was no real difference to the other visual conditions. And we found that our active haptic feedback increased the emotional arousal, but there might be other factors more relevant for social presence and emotional valence. Which brings us to future work and ways to address some of our limitations. And I think first it would be really helpful to explore the boundary conditions for pseudo-haptics and also for active haptic feedback devices. We need more diverse samples and study scenarios in general. A validated measure for the illusion of touch would be really helpful because the rubber hand illusion adapted items we used, they worked surprisingly well, but I think a measurement instrument that can be used across multiple of studies would be really nice. And finally, I think it would be also worthwhile to explore the effect of social context and different design parameters, avatar designs, and so on the emotional valence and social presence, which might be more relevant in this case. And so this concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. On the final slide, you can see the references that were used for this presentation. And I hope you are now interested in reading our paper. Thank you.